So this is a very strongly worded column, I think it's fair to say. And when you talk about that destabilizing effect of abandoning the community of nations, can you connect that up with some of the developments we're watching around the world today? For example, London on Saturday, Qatar overnight, and its ostracism within the Gulf region. Is there a connection between the U.S. stepping back from a leadership role and what's going on around the world?
I'm not going to connect the president's rhetoric and actions to any specific terrorist action. Terrorism's never right. Terrorism's never justified. We need hugely robust approaches. I think there's a tendency on the part of some of the president's critics to blame him for everything that's bad that happens, and I think that's wrong. That having been said, we have stood in the United States since the Second World War for the idea of a community of nations that cooperate with respect to global problems. The two advisors of the president who were held out as leading internationalists took to the Wall Street Journal last week to declare that there's no such thing as a community of nations. Those well-known mushy people, Ronald Reagan, Henry Kissinger, and James Baker, George W. Bush, regularly used the concept of the community of nations as what the United States was trying to uphold. When we step away from that, our adversaries have to suspect that we're going to do less for other nations. Other nations are going to feel more strongly that they have to take matters in their own hands. And we saw that experiment. We saw that experiment after the First World War, when nations pulled away from each other, when the United States didn't join the League of Nations, when Britain and France stood for maximizing reparations from Germany rather than trying to create some kind of international system. So this is a potentially catastrophic philosophy, and it comes at a moment when we have the very serious terror threats that you talked about, and I suspect ultimately more consequential, we have the challenge of integrating into the global system a rising China. You know, my colleague Graham Allison at Harvard just has an important new book out on the Thucydides trap, talking about the difficulty the international system has in accommodating the rise of major nations. And those are very hard problems, but they're that much harder when the leading nation in the world eschews the value of cooperation, and indeed eschews the very value of rationality by putting forth budgets that have arithmetic errors, by denying that global climate change is a reality, by publishing economic forecasts that are out of touch with reality. We're in, and I disagreed with plenty that Ronald Reagan did or George W. Bush did, but I never would have said we had seen the first post-rational presidency. But that is what I fear we're looking at now, and I think it's terribly, terribly serious for the world. And I think the question the world is going to ask itself, and is asking itself, I mean, I've traveled a lot in recent weeks, is this a temporary aberration for the United States, or is this the way the United States is going?
Right.
And the way they're going to answer that question is to look at other leading segments of society and see whether they're following the president or see whether they're backing off.
Well, exactly. And your column actually is addressed more to business leadership than it is to the administration, really urging CEOs to come off of those councils. We caught up with the JP Morgan CEO overnight over in China, and he had a somewhat different take. Listen to what Jamie Dimon had to say.
I am an American patriot, and I want to help the President of the United States. When someone is piloting the airplane, you want to root for the pilot, so I want to help them as best they can. It is very hard if you say, I'm going to go off of an advisory group or not do ABC because you disagree on one issue. I mean, you know, honestly, no one's going to agree with any president or prime minister everywhere on every issue. So I don't want to overreact to it.
So, Larry, why isn't Jamie Dimon right that even if we disagree with the president on some things, we owe it as a patriot to try to help him be better?
3 points. One, Jamie refers to it as one issue. There's an immigration ban, there's arithmetic that doesn't add up, There's climate change. There's crony capitalism and selective deals. This is hardly the first and only minor issue. This is a central part of philosophy. Does the United States believe in a community of nations? 2, Jamie should be prepared, and I would be prepared. I would hope any business leader would be prepared to offer the president advice. That is a very different thing than lending your prestige and that of your company to joining an advisory board of his creation. That is accepting a presidential appointment. 3rd, where does this principle stop? Jamie says it's one issue. What would cause him to back off? Now, look, our president is very different, and I think the rhetoric on the left that compares him to leaders in Europe in the 1930s is frankly overdone. That said, at what point as a patriot is your allegiance to your country rather than to your president? I've always thought of my allegiance as a patriot as being to my country. That's why if I had been asked to support the kind of policies that are being advocated by this administration while in government, I surely would have resigned. And make no mistake, the decisions that business leaders make send a very powerful signal both to the rest of the world and to the president. If Jamie and his colleagues on this advisory board resigned, not over the details of the Paris Agreement, but over the philosophy that the United States no longer believes in cooperation with other nations, in a community of nations, that would send a very powerful signal to the rest of the world, and it would send a very, very powerful signal to to the president and to people at home.
Right.
Now, look, I understand that these businesses have big stakes. They're regulated in many cases. They rely on the U.S. government in many ways. So I understand that it's not easy to be courageous. That's why I so admire Elon Musk and Robert Iger, who I believe took the right step here.
Right. Well, that's sort of the geopolitical issue, and that's also the political issue. But what's striking to me, Larry, is that the markets don't seem to bat an eye. You wind up having equities right at records, and you wind up having a 10-year yield touching its lowest level on Friday since the election. Which market, treasuries or equities, has the biggest sugar high right now?
Well, it's a hard thing to judge. I think the two markets are related. I think the judgment that interest rates are low for some very important structural factors, the kind of thing I talked about with secular stagnation and excess of saving over investment. I think that awareness, as it permeates into the market, is leading and is in part a cause of the stronger equity valuations that we've seen.
So when you take a look at the market, the lowest call I've heard so far is 1.5% on the 10-year from Scott Minerd over at Guggenheim. Do you subscribe to that kind of theory? Are we in the world where we're going to see 1.5?
That wouldn't be my prediction, and I know better than to make short-term bond market forecasts. But I do think that people have not appreciated how much the world has changed, how there are a whole set of factors that are like rising inequality, like demographic change, like people living longer, that are leading to more saving. And a whole set of factors, of which the most important might be the fact that capital goods now cost so much less, and that our economy is demassifying. Nobody needs malls anymore with Amazon, that are leading to less investment. And those two things together, more saving, less investment, means a structural reduction in interest rates, particularly real interest rates, and that's what we're seeing.
Larry, finally, is there one thing that you can agree with President Trump on, and that is infrastructure? We're going to hear just in about 4 hours' time from the president a plan to redo air traffic control in the country as a first step toward a major infrastructure investment. Is that something you can support?
I could support big reform in air traffic control. They're right about that. They're right about radar being bad and GPS being good, and we use radar. Here's the problem. The center of their plan seems to be, and to be fair, I haven't heard it yet, a nonprofit quasi-public corporation. The only nonprofit public corporations that I can think of that we have in the United States are the Post Office and Amtrak. And I don't think most Americans would regard that as a hugely successful formula. So I'm going to want to see why they think that this change in organization is really going to be enough to change things. But I applaud the decision to focus on infrastructure and to have air traffic control be the leading edge of that. But the question is, are they really going to find a feasible way of an aggressive, effective way of going at it, or are they going to use this buzzword of privatization? And I'm concerned in that regard, and we'll be watching anxiously to see what's said today.
Hey, Larry, if you had to pick one thing that would help change the dynamic here in the U.S., help growth, maybe to 2.5 to 3% GDP, and help yields, what would it be, the one thing?
Infrastructure investment and rational immigration policy.
What are the chances that you put that we get that?
Well under 50-50, because we're spending our time on budgets that don't add up, and on scandals, and on tweets. America's problems are solvable. They can be solved, but you have to focus on them and not focus on issues of personality. Why, with people dying in London, has the president chosen to make a political attack on London's mayor a central priority of White House rhetoric? Any CEO that did that would have would be exposed to a long talk, and not a very pleasant talk with his board. I wonder whether the Business Advisory Board, where they feel it's so important that they remain in order to be effective, have taken up those questions with the president. I rather doubt it, and I have to say that's troubling to me.
You know, the question is, of course, how he would respond.